except for maybe Laurel and Hardy, where the physical differences, the contrast in shapes, makes a difference. Or the chiseled rectangular jaw of Batman, in contrast with the triangular rat-shaped face of the Joker in The Dark Knight. Okay, maybe you don't believe me, but I'd at least like to try to demonstrate my point. And I promise, I won't do it with comedic or comic book characters who tend to be over-exaggerated. Instead, why don't I use the Academy Award-winning film American Beauty to show you how a skilled director and cinematographer can use shapes to inform character relationships. American Beauty, directed by Sam Mendes and shot by Conrad Hall, is a slice-of-life story of two families trapped in Middle America. It's a complex story with a variety of other storylines woven in. But in the section of the film I'd like to use as an illustration, all you really need to know is that a teenage boy named Ricky lives with his overbearing father, who's a colonel. And Ricky lives next door to a girl named Jane. He's been following her, and at this point in the film, we don't know how Ricky or Jane feel about each other, but we're about to find out. Now, in order to really show how the story plays out visually, I'm going to use some key storyboard panels. Typically, directors will use storyboards before they shoot to communicate their ideas visually. But in this case, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to use the boards to illustrate what happened in the real film. I'm going to walk you through 5 sequential scenes from the film to show you how Mendes and Hall manipulate shapes and line to communicate visually and to establish character relationships. And then afterwards, I'll let you decide whether this is a real technique or just theoretical balderdash, which it very well might be. But anyway, the scene starts with Ricky talking with his dad, Colonel Fitz, over breakfast. The scene kind of cross-cuts between the two characters, medium shot of Ricky, medium shot of his dad. Now, as you might imagine, the Colonel has a crew cut, and his son, Ricky, has a similar haircut. Both are in good shape, and both wear collared shirts. This gives both characters a very boxy, square appearance. And if we were looking at these shots as still images, or as a Rorschach test, the image might look like this. One boxed head talking to another boxed head, both in medium shot, both in the center of the screen. That's affinity. And guess what? These two characters are getting along in this scene. Just like the two triangle heads were getting along on the beach in Jaws. Same color patterns, same shapes, affinity. But then the doorbell rings and something interesting happens. When Colonel Fitz answers the door, he's confronted by two very colorful characters standing side by side in a two-shot and outlined by the doorway. Now this is very different from the previous drab-colored one-shot. Contrast, right? With more contrast to come, because when the neighbors give the Colonel a basket of food and flowers, they bring color into the Fitz's home, and it really starts to seem out of place. And when we see the wide shot of Colonel Fitz holding the flowers, we see really how out of place these colors are. We also see something else, or at least we might notice something else if we're really paying attention. 2 things, actually. First, we might notice that the sun is also in the shot. You'll see him in the background, and that makes this a 2-shot as well. But it's not the same kind of 2-shot as the one of the neighbors. You see, the neighbors are standing side by side, almost arm in arm. Ricky and his father, on the other hand, are separated. Literally, they're separated by space and a solid white line running through the frame. Secondly, we might notice that Ricky has changed his appearance. Now he's wearing a hat. His head is now round, as opposed to his father's still square head. Now this might seem accidental, or at least inconsequential, and it is, for now. But in the next scene, Ricky and his dad are fighting, and now the differences are apparent. For most of the scene, and for all of the argument, Ricky is on one side of the screen with a large, round head, and the Colonel Fitz, is on the other side with a large, square head. And this is contrast with a capital C. Father, son, square, round, left, right, hup, to, Ted, shun. It doesn't matter what they're talking about. We can just simply tell that they are in conflict. They are opposite in nearly every single way. But even that is not the point, because Mendes and Butler, they've got more in store. In the very next scene, we see Jane again. She's in a two-shot, talking with her friend. Her friend is on the left, and Jane is on the right. Coincidence? Maybe. Ricky's on the right in the previous scene, though. Jane is on the right in this scene. It's a coin flip, really. I mean, those would line up 25% of the time randomly, so maybe it's coincidence. And Jane's friend has long blonde hair, shaping her head kind of like a corkscrew. And she's wearing a colorful sweater. It's red. Metaphor for passion? Maybe. Jane is dressed in black. Oh yeah, and she has her hair pulled back, tight. It gives her head a very round appearance, just like Ricky's head, with his hat on. And remember, Ricky's now wearing a black jacket. And so, two characters, each on the right side of the screen, each wearing black, and each with a very, very round shape to their head. And then Mendes starts cross-cutting between these two characters. And what's really interesting, what's really telling, is this is what best illustrates my point, I believe. It's that Mendes and Butler place both characters in the exact same space on the screen. It's almost like they're the exact same shape on the Rorschach test. And that way, once Mendes cross-cuts a few times, we realize, either subconsciously or consciously, that these two people were made for each other. And even though the dialogue actually contradicts this idea, because in the dialogue they're arguing, but in the visual language says otherwise. Our visual literacy tells us that these two were meant for each other. And when Mendes punches in for a close-up of each character, first Ricky dominating the frame, and then Jane being dominated and isolated, staring up at him in close-up, we realize that she's fallen for the boy next door. Now, you'll have to see the movie for yourself, but believe me when I tell you that the dialogue in this scene is not romantic at all, in any way. In fact, Jane denies liking Ricky. But we know, because Mendes has telegraphed this information to us visually, using color, framing, and most of all, character shape. Just like Spielberg did in Jaws, and just like many, many other great directors do, all the time. If you want to dive deeper into these ideas, I highly recommend Bruce Bloch's book, The Visual Story. Bloch is Eisenstein Chair in Cinematic Design at the University of Southern California, and his book is a fun read with lots of examples on how filmmakers can and do use shape, line, and color, and a wide variety of other techniques to build a complex set of visual storytelling techniques. To demonstrate these ideas, let's look at another phenomenal film, Moonlight, winner of Best Picture at both the Academy Awards and the Golden Globes in 2017. To aid us in recognizing the visual grammar in this movie, we'll return to our technique of looking at film as a sequence of still images, analogous to photographs or paintings. On the most basic level, most modern films use color. And then we have to ask ourselves, is the color used in a random fashion? As it might be in a documentary that films live events right off the hip? Or is the use of color orchestrated? You see, most narrative films are orchestrated, meaning that the filmmakers, the director, cinematographer, location scouts, set and costume designers, etc., are choosing colors from a specific palette.